But thank you all for joining us for our first webinar in 2025, where we'll be discussing the zoning review, which is a requirement for bronze, which we'll discuss later. But if we'll go to the next slide, we can see what our agenda is for the day. We'll do a brief welcome and then have some program updates from Mackenzie Love, our program manager for the Charging Smart team, followed by a zoning review and best practices discussion and overview. And then, of course, as always, we'll discuss resources that are available to you all to be working on the zoning review, followed by a time for question and answers. But if you're having questions, feel free to throw them in the chat throughout. And then we'll wrap up hopefully at the top of the following hour. So if we go to the next slide, if you would change, I know I saw a lot of you already doing it, you know the drill, but if you would change your Zoom name to include the community that you're joining us from and what state you're representing, that's just really helpful for us and for other folks on the call to know where you're joining from. And then in the chat, if you would respond to the following question: has your community adopted an EV ordinance? If not, do you have plans to? And as you're doing those two tasks that I just said about for you, if you would also, it might be helpful today if you do have a zoning ordinance to have it pulled up, and you can be kind of comparing as we're talking about best practices and the zoning review. It might be helpful to like see what language you have in your code. So that might be something that's helpful as well as we're getting started here today. So I'll do a brief momentary pause for you all to do all those things that I just threw at you. But we're really happy to have you on today and are excited for this talk. So I'll give a brief momentary pause. I see some communities on that I know that you do have zoning ordinances, and some that I think is that something that is your next step. So exciting to see a range of different journeys. All right, so if we go on to the next slide, thank you. I do have an exciting announcement that we have. The Charging Smart team has a new member that's here to support you all in your EV journeys. Their name is Jem Thompson, and Jem is a program coordinator and transportation planner for our team. And so I do want to give a moment for Jem to come on and say a quick hello.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And yes, thank you everyone for having me this morning. Really excited to be joining the Great Plains Institute team, and especially working on the Charging Smart program. A little bit about myself. My background is in urban planning primarily, and really focused on active transportation and sustainable transportation planning. I've had chances to work in the private sector in a consulting role, also in academia in various research positions, and now really excited to kind of be merging all of my different interests and backgrounds in this new position, and really excited to help the communities on this call and others moving forward with designation and really any way that I can be of help. So excited to be here and excited to work with everyone.
Thank you, Jem, and we're excited to have you on board. You've already been a great asset to the team, and so we're excited for y'all to have a chance to work with Jem. If we go to the next slide, I do just want to, before we move on to the program updates, I'm seeing lots of great information in the chat about who has ordinances, who is working on making updates, and kind of what type of ordinance you might have as well. Perhaps it's maybe a little basic, and maybe some other have more complex ones. So I think this is a good range of people today. But moving on to program updates, I will hand the microphone over to my colleague, Mackenzie Love.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you in this first webinar of 2025. And I too have an exciting announcement for you, which is that Charging Smart launched nationally earlier this month and is now officially available in all states. This is a really strong reminder of the importance and how timely work on transportation electrification is. I know that I'm telling that to the people who are very much aware, given that you're dedicating your time to being on this webinar this morning. But I just wanted to share the good news with you. Thank you for taking the time to participate, and thank you for helping lay the foundation for this program to become such a strong resource for communities like yourself and your peers nationwide. We really appreciate everything that you're doing, both locally and the impact that it's having on this program. So thank you, and looking forward to seeing how we can keep this program going. I will drop a blog in the chat about from GPI about the launch in case you wanted to learn more, and we're always happy to answer questions, of course. That said, I do want to go ahead and address one other aspect of this program, which is that Charging Smart is funded by the Department of Energy, and we appreciate their support. But that leaves us, like many other people, working to understand the impact of some recent executive orders from the federal government on this program. I want to make sure that you can rest assured knowing that IREC, which is the lead on Charging Smart, has a signed contract in place, and we are analyzing those impacts, as I mentioned. In the meantime, we are proceeding with the work of this program as planned, and we'll let you know about any changes that are necessary as soon as they occur. But just rest assured that we're looking into it, and we will be in communication with you. That said, if you do have any questions or ideas to discuss at any point, the contact information for our team will be on the final slides of this deck today. So please feel free to reach out to us at any time, and we're happy to discuss and have any kind of conversations you'd like. I think that's it for the updates from me. So I'll hand it back to you, Rebecca, unless there's anything else that needs to be brought up at this time.
That should be great. Thank you, Mackenzie. If we move on to the next slide, we can get into kind of the meat of this presentation, which is about this zoning review and related best practices. So the next slide is talking about the reason that we're talking about this zoning review is twofold. The first reason is because regulation, like updating your zoning code to include EVs and its charging infrastructure, plays a crucial role in creating an environment that's conducive to EV adoption within your community. And so the foundational step for this is to the foundational step to making the updates, I should say, is analyzing what you currently have, the presence or absence of what you currently have, and we can do that through a zoning review. And so in the Charging Smart program, we do have some requirements to earn bronze, and 3 of those are within the regulation category, which focuses on zoning and permitting, if you'll recall. And so that first bullet point there, our 1.5, is stating what that requirement is. And I'll just go ahead and read it so that we have a good understanding of it. The requirement is review zoning requirements and identify restrictions that intentionally or unintentionally prohibit electric vehicle supply equipment, EVSE deployment, and then compile those findings in a memo. And so we will be talking about what that means today and what resources we have related to that. But then also just to level set, when I say electric vehicle supply equipment, EVSE, that is referring to the charging infrastructure, but then all the conduit and wiring that goes along with it. So you'll see that term throughout this presentation, just so that we all have a clear understanding of what that term means. There are also 2 other requirements that are in the regulation category, which are listed on this slide, are 3.1 and 3.4. We won't really be discussing them today, but I do want to remind you and kind of jog your memory of them. We did a webinar in November that was discussing this topic more fully, so I would encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't. And of course, if you have any questions about it, please feel free to reach out to us and ask. We're more than happy to help. So if we go on to the next slide, as we're talking about the zoning review, as I briefly mentioned, the goal of the zoning review is to do an assessment of your current ordinance and identify restrictions that prohibit EVs and charging infrastructure within it. Oftentimes within the code, there is language that can unintentionally or intentionally prohibit EVs and your infrastructure. And so doing this review is a really great way to minimize those restrictions within your code. And I think that this is relevant for if you currently have language in your ordinance about EVs, but also if you don't have an EV ordinance, these are really great things that you should be thinking about and things that you should maybe avoid, or maybe that you should make sure to include so that you can limit those restrictions before you even get started. So prevention is key. Another aspect of this, if we go on to the next slide, is once again, we have those EV for all points, which is making sure that we're completing criteria in a way that is increasing accessibility and reducing barriers for our community members who face the most barriers to entry for transportation electrification. So there are ways that you can earn EV for all points through this zoning review. And so I do just want to highlight it here at the beginning. And then also as we're talking about these different best practices, I'll also be highlighting more specific ways that you can be earning EV for all points. But this graphic on the slide is showing the requirement of doing the zoning review and gives a continuum of different actions that you can do to earn either 5, 10, 15, or 20 EV for all points. So as you're evaluating your current regulations and you're considering updates, we want to think about how each impact might, or each change might impact different segments of your community. So for instance, if you acknowledge that the community members who face, who those community members are that face the most barriers to EV adoption, in your memo, you could earn 5 EV for all points. Whereas if you went a little bit farther and identified and reflected on the requirements that currently exist or are absent from your requirements and how that might impact those groups, you could earn 10 points. I won't read the rest, but you could go ahead and look at these on your own time. I don't want to be reading things out to you, so I'll just pause here for a moment before we move on to discussing kind of what those best practices are for things that we should be looking for in our zoning ordinance. Great, so if we go to the next slide, the first topic that we're going to discuss is defining terms that you use in your ordinance. Similar to how I defined what I meant by EVSE, you should be providing definitions of key terms to help eliminate uncertainty and provide clarity and consistency on how your zoning regulations apply to charging infrastructure within your code. So this topic does have 2 related best practices. The first best practice is just simply that your zoning documentation defines EVs and EVSE terms, including what do you mean by electric vehicle? What do you mean by a charging station? Also good terms that aren't listed on this slide that are good to talk about are what do you mean by EV installed? What do you mean by EV ready? What do you mean by EV capable? We just want to eliminate all confusion that might arise from terms that developers or others might be unfamiliar with. And then the second best practice is that when you do have those definitions defined, that we're making sure that the definitions are broad and avoid restrictions to power levels or types of charging. So basically what we mean by this is that the industry is changing and evolving, and we want to make sure that our ordinance updates that we're making now are as evergreen as possible and can be flexible for those changes that might occur. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you an example of how this looks. This example comes from the city of Ann Arbor in Michigan, and this is a screenshot of just two of the definitions that they have in their code. And this is covering both best practices 1 and 2 because they have definitions in their code. And when they are making these definitions, they're not making them too restrictive. So if you look into the definition of the electric vehicle charging station that they have, that's that second definition, they say that they are requiring that their level 2 charging stations meet minimum industry level 2 requirements. And so by having that statement of meeting minimum industry requirements, that's allowing for flexibility of growth as industry requirements may evolve over time. So that's an example of how it is being broader and not too restrictive. And we will be sending out these slides afterwards, and I've linked the ordinance examples that we're giving here to each slide. So you can look more fully into these ordinances once we send these slides out. The next slide is talking about the next topic, which is permitting EVSE as an allowable accessory use in all zones. So when charging infrastructure is not the primary purpose of the property, we should be designating them as a permittable accessory use that explicitly authorizes their development. So when we do permit EVSE by right, it avoids the need for a zoning board review and significantly streamlines the zoning process, which then in turn saves your time, your staff time, as well as saves time for zoning boards and developers as well. So really just kind of a win-win situation for everyone. And we do have 2 related best practices to this. The first being that we just generally permit EV chargers as an accessory use across all zoning districts. And the second being that we permit accessory use by right and not require an additional discretionary review. So if we go to the next slide, we can have an example of how these look. Actually, we have 2 examples. The first example is coming from the city of Bloomington, Minnesota, and it states that EV chargers are permitted in every zoning district when accessory to the primary use. And then the second example of permitting accessory use EV charging by right comes from a city in New Jersey, and they are saying that EVSE shall be considered a permitted accessory use and shall not require a variance. And if you'll forgive me, I did do a little paraphrasing there, but that key shall not require a variance is saying that there's no additional review needed. One thing that I do want to point out is that when we allow anything as a permitted use in the zoning code, that is automatically stating that there's no other permit or approval needed by virtue of the definition of permitted use. So technically that first example of Bloomington is they're kind of making the same statement as Trenton, New Jersey, but they just don't have that shall not require a variance. But because it's permitted, it kind of implies that as part of the statement. So we're kind of getting into some technical zoning knowledge here, but hopefully it's all relatively clear. So if you have questions, please let me know. The next slide is we're moving on to the topic of primary use standards. So we were just talking about accessory use, and now we're talking about primary use. So when charging stations are clearly a primary use, we should have provisions in the code that allow EV chargers as an approved use of a specific site with a streamlined permit and zoning review. So this means that we don't want to be defining them as an existing use, such as parking or a fueling station or other automobile related uses. They're their own standalone use because charging stations just don't have the same environmental concerns as something like a fueling station. And so those reviews that are necessary for parking and fueling stations related to those environmental concerns that they have are unnecessary for charging infrastructure, and therefore that's an undue barrier and burden for EVSE installation. So for that same reason, EVSE as a primary use may be appropriate in a wide variety of zoning districts and only really be constrained by real estate and electric capacity concerns. So we do have 3 related best practices, of which I kind of covered a few of them in that spiel I just gave. But the first best practice is that we want to define primary use standards for EVSE as its own use. So once again, we want it to be distinguished from something like a fueling station. The second best practice is enabling EVSE as a primary use broadly across all zoning districts. And then the third best practice is establishing a streamlined pathway for approval of EVSE as a primary use. So really the goal for this specific best practice is that if for some reason you are going to designate EVSE as a conditional use, that means that it's going to be subject to case-by-case conditions in some zones, which means that a permitting process would be required. And this really, that isn't streamlined or clear to the developer because they wouldn't know what those conditions are unless you state them in your code. So when a developer is looking at your code, they should be able to have a full understanding of what the requirements are. And so all this to say is that we want to think about this as a partnership. So you as a community, you are well within your rights to regulate how you want charging infrastructure to exist within your community. As long as the standards are the same to other land uses, so you're not putting additional conditions onto EVSE that aren't required by other land uses. And developers at the same time have a reasonable right to say that the process should be transparent and predictable for them. So they should be able to look at your ordinance and have an accurate sense of what the expectations are and the level of time or difficulty it might take them to install charging infrastructure within your community. So that's kind of what this best practice is looking at, and we have examples of this. So if you'll recall, that first best practice is about defining primary use standards for EVSE as its own use. And this example, the first example, comes from a community in Washington, and they are saying that level 3 or direct current fast chargers are a permitted use, and then they list a few different zoning districts where that is permissible. And one thing that I do want to call out here that can be a little tricky, but sometimes the absence of something is significant. So by listing level 3 as a permitted use, they are defining it as something separate from other land uses like fueling stations. So the absence of saying something like, and will be considered as a fueling station is separating its use from from being considered that sort of land use, and thereby requiring it to go through those reviews. And so we don't want you to have a phrase that says, and will be considered a fueling station. So the absence of this in that first example is what we're looking for. And then for both best practice 2 and 3, which, just to jog your memory, best practice 2 was enabling EVSE as a primary use broadly across zoning districts. And best practice number 3 was establishing a streamlined pathway for approval. The example comes from Madison, Wisconsin. They, in a memo clarifying their ordinance, states that charging infrastructure would be permitted uses in a variety of different zoning districts. So that's a broad sweep of what is allowed. And once again, kind of because of the lack of a statement in this, it is significant. They are saying that charging stations are permitted use, which means no additional review is needed, and thereby that inherently makes the process more streamlined. Whereas if we compare it to the example from Washington above, while they did have some permitted uses, they also, if you'll notice, have a statement that I bolded where they're saying there's a conditional permit, a conditional use permit required, and that is then triggering a review process. And so in this, what those conditions needed for the conditional use permit are not listed. And so that does provide some barriers for developers. They wouldn't have a clear understanding of what those expectations are. So once again, that absence is key for the third example of creating a streamlined pathway. Great. So if we go to the next slide, I've been talking a lot at you. We just heard about 3 different topics related to the zoning review. And so I do just want to pause for a moment for you all to reflect on your own zoning ordinances or what you might want to add to your zoning ordinance based off of those 3 topics. So I want you to think about, and this can be either internally, if you do want to, feel free to share something in the chat about how it shows up in your zoning ordinance, if you feel comfortable with that. You can reflect on, do you have EV terms defined? Are there terms that you would want to add, or terms that you think you should define if you, if you're still working on your zoning ordinance? And then for that second topic that we discussed, are charging stations permitted as an accessory use within your code? And have you defined when charging stations are a primary use? And if so, is that streamlined? Is that a streamlined process for developers? I'll give you a brief moment here. And I'm just I think I saw some questions coming across in the chat. And so I'm gonna take a moment to look at those as well as you're reviewing. Yes, and so Will, I see your question from examples of potential code language that can be restrictive. Hopefully, as we're walking through this, you're getting that question answered. And we're more showing positive language. I did just show that conditional use that might be a little more restrictive, but I'm happy to provide additional I always like to show positive examples, but would be happy to share some examples that we might want to stay away from too separately. Great. So hopefully you've taken this moment of reflection, and we'll move on to our next topics. Our next topic is related to fire and safety standards. And our best practice in this is that we want to clearly define fire and safety standards that apply to charging infrastructure. And we do want to avoid, and this will be a topic throughout, and And so I think this is a really important one that I do want to emphasize, is that we want to make sure that we're avoiding defining standards that are more restrictive than other development types. So it's okay to have standards, but as I mentioned earlier, we don't want it to be above and beyond anything else that might be land use or development type within your code. So an example of this, and there are more ways to incorporate it, but yes, Mutaz, if you go to the next slide. There's an example from Oakdale, Minnesota that says EV charging infrastructure shall be installed in compliance with state building and electrical code. So that's one way that you can address kind of those standards. There's other standards that we'll discuss more later, so I didn't want to highlight those, but there could be safety standards like physical safety standards around lighting, or making sure that there's no trip hazards around that charging infrastructure. So there's different ways that we can be considering this this best practice. But if we go on to the next slide, we will be discussing accessibility standards. And we want to make sure that we clearly define accessibility standards that are aligned with national standards. And once again, similar to what I just said for the fire and safety, we want to avoid defining standards that are more restrictive than other development types. But our best practice here is ensuring that we have that the EVSE regulations that we have are compliant with the ADA and the National Access Board standards, which, if you're not familiar with those standards, there's some really good standards for what an accessible charging space can look like, and or state level accessibility guidelines. And so if we go to the next slide, there's an example from St. Louis Park on how they defined accessible spaces within their code. And so they're saying that their spaces should be located adjacent to and have the ability to serve accessible parking spaces that are defined and required by the ADA. So when you adopt statements like what St. Louis Park has in your code, if we go to the next slide, it will inherently earn these EV for all points. However, in our memos, we can reflect on if ADA and National Access Board standards already exist within our code, or if they're absent, and how we might and how that presence or absence might be affecting or impacting the disabled community members that might want to be using those spaces. So that would earn you, if you make that reflection in your memo, that would earn you EV for all points. But you could also take it a step further and make a commitment statement within that memo that you will address ADA requirements within your code. So with that, you would want to be sure to include what specific requirements you would be adding to your code, or maybe you might have statements that you might revise or remove as well to be more compliant with this best practice. So if we go on to the next slide, we're moving on to talking about design standards. So when we are talking about design standards, we want to clearly define and illustrate what those design standards are. And we want to define what they are, but then we also want to avoid overly prescriptive parking design standards so that we can account for variations in site conditions and layouts, right? Because it's really hard to have one size fits all sometimes when we're talking about design standards. And so we want to make sure that we're stating what those standards are, but that they can be flexible for all sorts of different conditions. And then once again, as always, we do want to avoid defining standards that are more restrictive than other development types. So we do have two best practices within design standards. The first one being that design requirements are flexible and performance-based when possible to account for variations in site conditions and layouts. So some things that you might want to consider, and that I kind of mentioned earlier too in that safety, the safety topic, was providing shade, or thinking about pedestrian safety, or thinking about lighting and landscaping, those sort of things. And then for best practice number 2, we want to make sure that we include language authorizing local planning staff to review and approve alternative design options if strict compliance within the guidelines is not possible. And we'll look at the next slide, has 2 examples of this. The first best practice, which once again is having flexible and performance-based design requirements, comes from La Crescent, Minnesota. They have a couple different standards that they've set out here. One is for the cords. They're saying that the cord should be retractable or have a place to hang. So they're not being super prescriptive of how that should look. They're just saying that the station should have a cord management system, and it should minimize tripping hazards. And so it's kind of leaving it open to how that might look. And in the same vein, they are saying that these charging stations should have adequate lighting available. And so they're not saying like every charging station has to have 5 of this specific type of light. It's saying it just needs to have lighting, and we'll leave it up to you how that looks. I do also want to notice, I did skip over D there, which they are saying that charging cords connecting to the charger shall be configured so that they don't, cause any hazards. And they specifically call out accessibility routes. And so that is a way that you can get EV for all points as well, because you're taking care with those accessibility routes. And then they're also noting shall be configured is leaving it up to you or the developer how it should be configured, and not having a specific site plan that everyone has to follow. So if we go to the next slide, I did briefly mention, or you know what? I'm so sorry. Could you go back, Muntas? I realized that I forgot to even talk about best practice number 2. Forgive me. So best practice number 2, which if you'll recall, is about including language that authorizes local planning staff to review and approve alternative site designs. So this example comes from New Jersey, and they have language in their code that says, that specifically states that the guidelines should, or the criteria should be seen as guidelines, and that flexibility can be allowed when alternatives are better than what is listed in the code. So that's one way that we can make sure that we have flexibility in our designs. So now if we go to the next slide, I got ahead of myself there. I mentioned how La Crescent added accessibility routes for EVs for all points, but this is also showing how you can establish guidelines for safety measures for charging stations with a special focus on how situations could affect different groups within your community. So thinking about age or race or gender, which all might have different safety implications when installing charging infrastructure. So, so if you're reflecting on that in your memo, that is an additional way that you could get EV for all points within the memo. So if we now move on to, oh yeah, I have a little reflection slide brought in here. So once again, kind of think back to the last 3 topics that we just discussed. In your zoning ordinance, how have safety concerns been addressed? Is there language about accessibility within your zoning ordinance? And if you don't, maybe reflect on what does that mean for community members if stations aren't accessible to them? And do you have design standards that are consistent with the standards that are set for other land uses? So once again, kind of, we want to make sure that anything that we might require is consistent with across the board. So take a moment here. I want to make sure that we have time for any questions that you might have. So I'm going to keep the ball moving here, but just feel free to kind of mull over that as we continue to discuss, because we do have two more topics to talk about. The first being minimum parking requirements. So when minimum parking requirements exist, the additional charging stations may violate those requirements. And so that leads us to the best practice of making sure that we allow EVSE parking stalls to count towards minimum parking requirements. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see an example from East Lansing, Michigan, on how they have a statement that says EV charging stations may be counted as a parking space in the calculation of the parking spaces as required by the code. So that's a simple statement that you can have that that covers those minimum parking requirements. And if we think about how we can add EVs for all into this mix, if we go to the next slide, we can see that one thing that you can also make sure to call out for in your ordinance is counting accessible ADA parking spots with charging space, with charging stations to count as 2+ parking spots to count towards that parking minimum. And so you can reflect on if you want to add that requirement or that statement into your zoning ordinance in that zoning memo, which could earn you those EV for all points if you're clear about what would be added or what would be removed to address this specific topic. So the next and final, last but not least, topic here is EV ready requirements. So since I'm sure many of you are aware that it costs significantly more to retrofit a parking space with EVSE than it is to just install it during construction or major renovations. So to kind of nip this in the bud, it's good to make sure that we have requirements about how many charging infrastructure or charging stations or EV ready or capable stations that we would like to see installed during major renovations or new constructions. And requiring developers to prepare for the future installation of EV chargers ensures that, you know, they're ready for EVs and that we're making them accessible as possible. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that Richfield, Minnesota has a table within their zoning ordinance that has specific requirements for EV charging stations and EV ready stations. And this is kind of harkening back to our very first topic that we talked about. This is why it would be good to make those definitions in your ordinance about what do we mean by EV installed and what do we mean by EV ready, so that it's as clear as possible for developers. I do also want to highlight that they have requirements in that additional requirements column that says that requires a certain number of ADA spaces for certain use cases. So that is one way to earn EV for all points within your zoning ordinance. And I think I have a slide on that if we go to the next one. Yes. So in addition to making requirements for ADA spaces within your code, you can also make requirements for multifamily parking to be EV capable, EV ready, or EV installed. And multifamily, as many of us may be aware, they face a significant burden to accessing charging since they're living in a space where that's a little bit more difficult to provide and they don't have garages where they can just plug in. And so if you're reflecting on in your memo on if you would like to make requirements for multifamily parking to have a specific number of EV installed, capable, or ready charging stations, that could earn you EV for all points as well. So that brings us to the end of the zoning review and what you should be looking for in your zoning ordinance and what those best practices are of what we would like to see eventually in your zoning code. So we do have some resources to help you out. And if we go to the next slide, the first thing that we have is a zoning review template. And this is, I'm really excited that we have this. It walks you through literally everything that we just talked about today. And if you complete this template and have do a really thorough job of having that reflection, you can earn that bronze criteria that we talked about today, the R1.5. So we'll make sure to send this link out to you in our follow-up email to this, but this talks about everything that we discussed today and helps you walk through that process of doing this foundational zoning ordinance review. So if we go to the next slide, I also want to highlight, we just published a program guide. If you haven't seen it, this is really, really, really helpful. It goes through every single criteria in the program, provides a description of the criteria, provides how an explanation of how you could provide verification that you completed that criteria. And it also provides community examples and links to helpful resources for completing that action. And so I'm really just thrilled that we have this. We'll also send out the link to the program guide. One thing that I would, as you're going through the zoning review, one thing that I might recommend that you look at is in the regulation category, we have a bunch of different criteria related to things that should be added into your zoning ordinance. And so you might be thinking about like, I just don't even know what I should be adding. Those actions are really great guides to what should be put into your zoning ordinance. And those are actions that you can reflect on in the zoning memo and say, we would really like to add a statement about ADA accessible parking stations counting towards as 2+ parking stalls in towards our parking minimum. So it will help you kind of think through what those actions could even be, or percentages of how much we would like to require for EV ready installations in new constructions, for instance. So I really encourage you to take advantage of this resource. If we go to the next slide, we also have some other resources related to zoning ordinances that you could take a look at. Two of them are more guides and give more examples of specific language that communities have implemented into their zoning ordinance, as well as a kind of an EV ready parking 101 for local governments, which could help you think through why, or others in the city, think through why it's important to have EVs addressed within our zoning ordinance. So it could give you some helpful talking points if there's some convincing that needs to go on your side of things to move forward with a zoning ordinance. And once again, we'll provide all of these links to you in a follow-up email. And as always, don't hesitate to reach out to us if, if you're like, hey, do you know of any city that has, this in their zoning ordinance? We're more than happy to help you with that research, review your ordinance before it goes through the, for what points it could get. Happy to help you out in any way such as that. All you have to do is reach out to us. So, we have about 10 minutes left, so I do want to open up the floor to anyone who might have questions for us about zoning ordinance related things, about the zoning review. We're here to answer those questions. So So feel free to either put those questions that you have in the chat, or you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. Ask the question verbally.
Hi, my name's Trey Sheldon. I'm a zoning plan examiner at the city of Cincinnati. And we're kind of looking at ways we can include this in our zoning code. And we've generally treated, like you stated, we are starting to treat charging stations, or at least the larger ones, not a residential one, but more commercial one, commercial scale, as we would personal services, such as like a laundromat or something, rather than a fuel station, for example. So you pointed that out. So that's one way we handle that. But we were concerned about some of the things that you see further out from the city, when you're at a big truck stop or something, and then you have a fuel station or traditional gas station, and they have like a lot of TV screens with ads and signage things, and every one of the gas station pumps has a TV screen in it, is blaring out Maria Menounos and things like that, and all these kind of advertising things that are going on there. We're just thinking about like in a more a commercial pedestrian district for us, for example, where you might see mixed use more pedestrian oriented land use, how to deal with those kind of adverse effects of a traditional fuel station that would would not be welcome in the city. So I don't know if anybody's ever addressed anything like that, like adverse effects of, things that would be in common with a fuel station.
Yeah, I have seen, and I'll have to dig it up because I don't quite remember what community it was, but they were concerned about the same thing, about not necessarily wanting advertisements on their charging stations installed in the community, and they did write something about that into their code. So I'll look into that and follow up with you. But it is something that you should be considering, and as long as you're not, providing undue burden, if you state it clearly within your code, then that would be easy for developers to see and understand and know that that's what the expectation is within your community. I think the issue is if you have that in the back of your mind, and that's something that you want to apply in certain zoning districts every single time, but you don't have that written into the code, that's when that becomes more of a burden to developers. So we can definitely provide some additional insight and do some research into if other communities, beyond that one example that I'm thinking of, have made any requirements around that. Other questions or similar things that you're thinking about? If not, and if maybe there's something specific to your community that you'd prefer to reach out to us over email or set up a meeting with us, we'd be open to that. Mumtaz, if you would go to the next slide. I just want to make sure that before we sign off, that you all have our contact information. Please reach out to us. We are more than happy to help connect you to, or support your work. And so if you want to be connected to other communities, or if you're looking for examples like Trey was of communities have done a specific thing, we are here and we can help out with that. So I know I've said it like 3 times, but please do not hesitate to reach out. We are here for you. We don't know how to help you if you're not communicating that with us. So once again, I do want to reiterate that zoning review is something that is required for bronze, and subsequently for any other designation. If you haven't done it and you want to get silver, you have to first do this zoning requirement, since it is a review, since it is a good foundational piece to kind of springboarding to other other zoning related criteria. And so, we look forward to helping support you all move through the zoning review process and using that template to do the review. So we'll be sending out a follow-up email that has a link to this recording, has a link to the program guide and the template, as well as the other resources that we discussed today. But I do want to thank you all for joining us, and to keep an eye out for that email, as well as we'll be having another webinar, informational webinar at the end of February. We have not yet decided a date, but keep an eye out for our next series. And with that, thank you all, and have a good rest of your Wednesday.